Hello and welcome to this lecture on the Inclusive book launch hosted by the Institute of Structural Engineers. I'm Ed Warner and I'm absolutely delighted to be chairing this session today. We've got a huge amount of amazing content packed into the next hour of coverage, covering a really important topic, publicising the launch of the Inclusive Design book. I'm delighted to introduce this book, which will equip and empower structural engineers to really positively impact the inclusive design process. Our buildings and spaces currently exclude a significant proportion of our population, and structural engineers have a really unique opportunity to shape the inclusive design of buildings and spaces. Structural engineers are so often involved right at the start of the design, build, and even the planning stages. And you all have a responsibility to make our environments as accessible and inclusive as possible. I hope what today demonstrates is the need to push beyond minimum standards and not to accept building regulations as being the ultimate guide for an inclusive building and space. And what we should be doing is engaging the lived experience wherever we possibly can to ensure we create really beautiful, accessible, and inclusive buildings and spaces for everybody. I wanted to set the scene a little bit around the importance of inclusive design and demonstrate what's possible when designing really beautiful, accessible and inclusive spaces. And for anyone new to this topic, I thought it was a good idea just to share the definition of inclusive design. And inclusive design effectively aims to remove the barriers that create undue effort and separation and stress for people, enabling everybody to participate equally, confidently and independently in everyday activities. For those of you in the UK, you'll be aware that that protected characteristics are very much covered in the Equality Act of 2010, but on a more international level, the acts around the international acts around human rights also very much focus on inclusive design and the need to consider design of buildings and spaces so that they're accessible and inclusive for everyone. The reason that inclusive design has been such a topic of conversation over the last few years is there is a growing realization that we can't design to the minimum standards of building regulations and expect our buildings and spaces to be accessible for everybody. The images captured here are the UK building regulations of Part M. If you're tuning in from the US, and Jennifer will be very aware of all the codes and regulations around ADA in the US, and there are a number of other regulations around the world. The problem with our global regulations is they just don't cover the considerations that are needed to design spaces for everybody. Regulations have tended to focus more on design for physical disabilities, in particular wheelchair users. But in reality, only 7 or 8% of disabled people are wheelchair users. So it's important to think about how our environments are designed not only for wheelchair users, but also the 93% of people who may have another physical, cognitive, sensory need, in particular neurodiversity, which Jennifer will be talking about, but also thinking wider than that and considering other protected characteristics like design for faith, ethnic background, culture, age, and gender. And if we're going to really truly design spaces that work for everybody, we need to be building in feedback from people with the lived experience of these protected characteristics as early as possible into the design process. Because if you can have their voices, if you can have voices heard from many different perspectives at that early stage, we're going to design and build environments that work for everybody. I'm going to take just a few minutes before handing over to Jennifer to demonstrate what's possible when designing inclusive environments, and also cover the business case, the positive business case for doing so. And I wanted to pick out one particular example of a client we've worked with over the last couple of years. This is Hotel Brooklyn in Manchester, owned by Bespoke Hotels, who are the largest independent hotel group in the UK. Hotel Brooklyn built a new hotel in Manchester, 190 bedrooms. 18 of those bedrooms were fully accessible rooms, and Hotel Brooklyn won Accessible Hotel of the Year a couple of years ago for some of the design features that I'm going to take you through now. But the types of considerations that were made at early planning stage, and structural engineers were very much involved in considering at a very early stage, were things like interconnecting rooms next to wheelchair accessible rooms for lots of people traveling with family members or carers. They need them in close proximity, but not necessarily sleeping in the same room. So having that interconnecting door is a really important feature. Having really inspirational, not institutional looking bathrooms and wet rooms is another important inclusive design feature. So many hotel bathrooms tend to look really clinical and quite medical, hospitalized in their design look and feel. And what we want to do with the architects and interior designers and the client at Hotel Brooklyn is to bring the design look and feel of the hotel into that bathroom, so that these rooms look as beautiful as any of the non-accessible rooms in the hotel. But considerations for structural engineer here were around things like the floor build-ups, the wall reinforcement for cantilevered grab rails and shower seats, which again are so often forgotten on developments. You find grab rails and shower seats coming off walls because the structure just simply isn't there behind the wall for those supports. Simple things like tea and coffee making facilities at the right height, as well as mini bar and safe at a height that's accessible for a wheelchair user, but also someone shorter in stature. The close rail pulls out towards users, so the close rail is accessible for everybody. Again, a really clever sort of structural consideration that we built in at an early stage was this recessed ceiling track hoist. Before Hotel Brooklyn, there were no hotels with ceiling track hoists in Manchester, and there are very few of them in the UK and around the world. But for so many people, having a hoist to be able to maneuver them from bed into a wheelchair or into a mobile commode to access the bathroom is really important. But so many hotels don't want a ceiling track hoist because it's a medical looking feature, and they struggle to sell that room. So what we did was we recessed the ceiling track into the soffit of the ceiling. We made a lighting detail out of that hoist track, and then disguised the motor within a bit of joinery. And structurally, all of those ceilings were planned to accommodate that ceiling track hoist. So again, if you didn't need that hoist, you wouldn't know it was there. You'd just think it was a clever lighting detail. But for so many people who need that sort of access feature, it's been built into Hotel Brooklyn. And other features around inclusive design were, ample circulation spaces in reception areas. You can see a lowered reception desk for wheelchair users, someone short of stature or just wanting to sit down whilst checking in at reception. Restaurant areas, considering lighting, acoustics, tables, chairs that offer better access for people, and a sense of choice. Inclusive design is all about providing choice for people, and ensuring that you are embedding the right principles in different environments that are going to be suitable for different groups of people. And the bottom right hand image is just an example of really good use of natural light, natural materials, and planting. Really important inclusive design features, not just in hotels but in any development. Again, what some hotels are looking at the moment, similar to to the hoist feature is a room's called changing places facilities. This is an example of a changing place facility that has been designed into a hotel called the Londoner in Leicester Square that opened last year. This is a larger than average sized wheelchair accessible toilet, but it also has a shower, a height adjustable changing bench, and a ceiling track hoist in that room. Again, for so many guests who require the slightly more assistance, a changing place facility is a really important consideration to think about. And from a structural engineer's point of view, considering and future-proofing environments to be able to accommodate this type of equipment is really important. But again, from a designer's perspective, making sure that these rooms don't look and feel overly clinical in their design look and feel. So again, this particular room at the Londoner represents very similar finishes to the rest of the hotel. And I think the penultimate slide for me, just around what's possible, is don't put up with the standard doc pack that gets dragged and dropped from architect's drawing to the next. As structural engineers, as part of those early conversations, please let's think about design of these environments not as being second best. This is exactly the same room using a different set of materials and finishes. And the most impact structural engineers can have in those very early planning stages with client and design team is to really fly the flag and try and push the boundaries beyond the minimum standard, which is shown on the left, to make sure we are creating really inspiring and suitable environments for everybody. In fact, this isn't my penultimate slide. I've got two to go. The Institute of Structural Engineers just wanted me to cover off just quickly the business case for getting inclusive design right. And this goes back to a business case that we ran with Hotel Brooklyn. The image on the left shows just how high the spend is in this area. So £12.4 billion is spent in the UK every year in hospitality, where one member of the travelling party has a disability. There is a massive market, not just in the UK, but around the world, for more accessible tourist destinations. And in the first year of trading, Hotel Brooklyn ran a return on investment case study, which is shared on the right-hand side, which found in the 12 months of trading, the accessible rooms generated an additional £217,000 worth of additional revenue versus the non-accessible rooms. And within that number was £85,000 worth of event revenue from events that the disability industry were running because they've been trying to find an accessible hotel. So, this is evidence that this isn't just socially and morally the right thing to do, but inclusive design makes sound financial sense as well. I just wanted to finish by saying a big thank you to all the contributors of this wonderful book that is published today. This really has been a labour of love for so many people over the last 3 years, and there are so many great nuggets of information for structural engineers in this book that will help encourage you and others to think about how we can design more accessible and inclusive environments for everyone. I'm going to take this opportunity to hand over to Jennifer. So Jennifer, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ed. I'm so pleased to be here. I want to talk to you all about designing a neuro-inclusive world and why you are a key part of that. I'm a principal at Verona Carpenter Architects, and together with my partner, Irina, who you see here top middle, I run an architecture and interiors practice in Manhattan with 8 humans and 1 dog, Mela. We work on a wide range of projects and scales, public buildings and spaces, schools, galleries, bathhouses, historic building renovations. And across all of these projects, our practice is focused on neuro-inclusive design, embracing and supporting the range of neurotypes that define our human population, And my goal for the next 10 minutes with you is to give you a better understanding of what this means so that you'll want to join me and share in this approach. I'd like to start with some basics. We live in a neurodiverse world where differences in brain functioning are part of the normal variation in the human population. A world where between 15 and 20% of the population is neurodivergent in some way. That is, they have a less typical neurotype, including people with ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, Tourette's, also with intellectual and neurogenetic disabilities, and including people with autism, like my son, who loves the New York subway and to a slightly lesser extent, loves the London Underground. These identities cut across all races, genders, ages, and economic backgrounds. Ours is a world where many must navigate the complexities of modern life while dealing with anxiety, mental illness, and post-pandemic trauma as well. And while our experience of the built environment is often communal, it is also individual, mediated through our bodies and our senses, and thus it is different for everyone. For many neurodivergent people, the built environment creates barriers to participation. And these are a few of the many photos I've taken where people are showing visible signs of sensory distress in the environment. But the distress is also not always evident to onlookers. So why this difficulty? Well, it's in part because sensory integration is difficult for many neurodivergent individuals. And sensory integration, just to define that, is the neurological process that organizes sensations both from your body and from the environment and makes it possible for you to use your body effectively. That is, to do what it is you want to or need to do in an environment. And when this integration process is impaired in some way, individuals can have an over or under response to stimuli, and this response can change from day to day and over time. It is not fixed, and it can be disabling. So in our neurodiverse world, there is no such thing as a universal response to a space. Our experience is individual, but the world is not currently designed for this diversity of experience. Most of our spaces are designed for and by people who fit pretty tight brackets of the so-called norm. This practice is not socially sustainable. A viable future depends as much on social sustainability as it does on environmental sustainability. A future in which all voices can participate is a future that is more resilient in the face of climate change and more equipped to combat inequity. So social sustainability means designing for the greatest range of bodies and also the greatest range of minds. I've long known that it's my duty as an architect to dismantle the barriers that are faced by those with physical disabilities. And Ed spoke about some of the codes that we have in place internationally to ensure that whether you can walk through the door or climb up some stairs will not determine whether you can go to a library or play in the park. But as we know, we need to go beyond those codes in the ways you're hearing about today. And we also need to dismantle the barriers that are faced by those with more hidden disabilities in our neurodiverse world. Barriers like spaces that offer no escape from sensory input, like a crowded subway platform. Barriers like spaces that don't offer enough sensory stimulation, like a lunchroom at our neighborhood elementary school, where a student routinely throws himself against a column because there is no other way for him to get the tactile input that he needs. There's barriers like rigid planning around what activities can take place where in a space. And perhaps the most significant barrier, limited ideas about what it means to have worth and to be worth making space for. So how do we redesign the world? We do it together, realizing that designing for greater inclusion is a mandate for all of us. And we do it in collaboration with neurodiverse communities and with neurodivergent self-advocates. And you are an important part of this enormous project. We need each other because the answers are not always clear. This is something we figure out together, and structural engineers need to participate. At Verona Carpenter, we're working on architectural solutions. You will come up with ideas that we have not thought of. As structural engineers, you are a respected voice on the design team. And maybe you don't always feel like that's true, but it is true. And you can therefore also be a strong voice for inclusion. We can work together to create places with more affordances, meaning more offerings for more people, more options for ways of occupying, places that are flexible, can change over time, that have better acoustics and are easier to navigate and understand, that provide places of respite and escape, that give choice. You've heard about that today, choice, and empower, and that incorporate more biophilic elements for comfort, that are accessible from both a physical and a sensory perspective, that incorporate redundancy when necessary, providing multiple spaces with different characteristics instead of a one-size-fits-all space that does not actually fit all. And by designing with and not just for, our design teams and our client teams need to include neurodivergent voices. At Verona Carpenter, I'm really excited that we're currently working on a project to redesign New York City public space for more neuro-inclusion. And we're meeting with neurodivergent kids and their families to figure out, what does this mean? And we'll be prototyping ideas in New York City and then testing with stakeholders. And we'll be working with structural engineers and asking for their help. For example, how to provide excitement and a sense of danger that many kids crave in a safe way. So we will need your help figuring out this student's 400-foot ladder and 200-foot slide, and this student's accessibility elevator that they would like to make completely out of wood and rope. And I have some great news. When we design to meet the urgent needs of some, we make better spaces for everyone. And this is called the curb cut effect. A curb cut makes it possible to navigate from the street to the sidewalk if you use a wheelchair for mobility. And at the same time, this curb cut makes the streetscape easier for everyone to use, including strollers and scooters, delivery carts. Similarly, when we design spaces that give people more choices and options that meet a range of sensory needs, we can make spaces where neurodivergent stakeholders and all stakeholders can be more comfortable. So let's end with a to-do list. 1, design with and not for. You can help build neurodiverse teams, hire neurodivergent people. If you're not in a hiring position, talk to the people who are. Suggest that a neuro-inclusion expert be added to the team. 2, advocate for social sustainability as the equal partner of physical sustainability. 3, destigmatize disability by talking about it. Disability is not a bad word. The environment is disabling, and this needs to be acknowledged and it needs to be addressed. And so I love participating in events like this one today with you and talking to some younger folks, as you see in the picture, because that's part of the answer. 4, keep learning about neuro-inclusion and apply it to your practice. And it's fantastic that you're here today because you've already started this. Read the book that we're launching at this event. In the chapter that I co-wrote with Tanya DeHoog, we give some specific ideas organized around senses for how structure can play a key role in neuro-inclusion. And 5, get out of your lane. We sometimes have too constrained an idea of what constitutes our role. So I want to encourage you to speak up. We always talk about the importance of designing for all bodies and minds to our clients, and you can too. The ideas for change don't need to come from the architect. You can also be an agent of change. So together, let's redesign the world. I want to acknowledge that this task is not just a design problem. A well-designed and engineered space can't make up for intolerant culture or for a lack of needed services. Design and engineering are not sufficient for creating more access and inclusion, but they are necessary. And the necessity of what we're doing really drives me forward and I hope it will help drive you forward too. Thank you so much. And with that, I will pass over to Rachel.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and good evening, everyone. And I will talk to you a little about the role of us as structural engineers in supporting inclusive design. So, as Ed said in the introduction, my name is Rachel Diath, and I'm a structural engineer and have been working in the industry for over 20 years. So, as we have already seen this evening and already heard, inclusive design is essential. As professionals working in the built environment, the whole project team has a responsibility and a duty to develop a world in such a way that it is safe and equitable and welcoming for everyone. This will help to remove barriers and allow and support a much broader range of individuals to interact with our designs in a positive way. And as we all know, a diverse team is one that generally comes up with the best solutions and is most enjoyable to work in. Inclusive design will also help us to achieve the important goal of sustainability in our built environment. As Jennifer has already pointed out, by considering the whole life cycle of a building or a space and its uses, we are able to foresee future needs and design for them from the beginning, helping to avoid the need for both financially and carbon expensive retrofits and adaptations in the future, or even premature demolition. And of course, as structural engineers, we don't work alone on projects, but as part of a team. It is the responsibility of the whole team, including ourselves, to consider inclusive design from the outset. So what can we actually do as structural engineers? As we've said, inclusivity is everyone's business, and each member of the design team, including us, need to make our own meaningful contribution to the overall inclusive design of our projects. As structural engineers, we have the opportunity to influence the design of the built environment in order to make sure that we achieve this. Alongside architects, we are often one of the first professionals involved in the building project. If we are able to make inclusive design a consideration from the start and offer a healthy challenge to the rest of the design team at each stage of construction and design, this will help to create buildings and spaces that are inclusive for everyone. Of course, the integrity and durability of a structure is rightly our key priority as structural engineers. However, we need to be balancing this with an awareness of how our structure will impact on other aspects of the building environment, such as a user's ability to move through spaces, lighting, acoustics, or temperature, for example, which can have real consequences on people's ability to use a space comfortably and equally. From the start, us as structural engineers should design with this awareness to increase the likelihood of ensuring that our designs will be experienced by all users in the way that they are intended for the whole life cycle of the building or structure. So if we think about our input into inclusive design throughout a project, we might think about the different project stages. As a structural engineer, you sometimes may find that the conceptual design and spatial coordination of a proposed project has already been largely settled by the time our services are engaged. On other occasions, we might be lucky enough to be involved at an early stage. In either case, it's really important that we understand the processes necessary, particularly in respect to inclusive design. This will help us to ensure that inclusive design is embedded in all of our design work and give us the knowledge and skills to encourage, support, and challenge the rest of the design team to ensure it remains a key driver throughout the project. As I've already said, during stages 0 and 1, for example, we may not be involved. However, having the whole design team on board at this early stage is a great way of making sure that the developing brief and design considers all aspects of inclusivity. If you're lucky enough to be on board at this early stage, take time to understand the inclusive design strategy that's being developed and consider what implications it could possibly have on the structure. Ask questions and broaden your understanding of the requirements and their implications. Obviously, a building must be laid out to make optimum use of its site, and the internal layout must similarly be optimized to provide maximum benefit for the building users or owners. Early decisions around structural grid and positioning of equipment, dimensions and arrangement of spaces are often very difficult to change later in the design. So it's really important to spend time at this early stage getting these right. and this is a key aspect which we as structural engineers can contribute to. As the concept design process progresses, take the opportunity to understand uses of the building and different spaces within it, and consider the implications they may have on the structure. Think about things like loading, or where you might be able to produce vertical structure, and what structural materials might be most appropriate, and what else you might need to consider as your design develops. Things like structural vibration, for example, or vertical and horizontal travel routes around the building. Capture these in a list that you might like to consider at the next stage. Additionally, at these early stages, we often think about the structural systems that we might use and how we might construct the building. Without having considered inclusion at this point, it would not be possible to judge the suitability of different structural systems, including proprietary options. For example, is the use of volumetric modular construction compatible with your access strategy? So there's lots of things that we as structural engineers can contribute at this early stage. As the project progresses and the scheme design starts, we work with the design team to develop our structural design and coordinate with everyone else. Ask questions about requirements, check loading assumptions, and think about what else might be needed. As Ed talked about earlier, think about hoists that might be required. If you have a steel frame, do you need to put in some extra steel beams and structure? Incorporate these into your design from an early stage and avoid late design changes and these things getting missed. Check things like lifting requirements and think about what else you might need to consider. For example, in the landscaping, is there aspects of structure that will need designing which are outside of the building? As the detailed design develops, you will work alongside the rest of the design team. Check back against your list from previous stages and make sure that you're considering all of the things that you noted. Confirm those loading assumptions and setting out the structure, particularly the vertical structure. Once the project goes to site, you need to make sure you work with the construction team closely to ensure that your design information is correctly interpreted and implemented. Take time to understand proposed construction sequences and how they might impact on your permanent design. One of the key things here I think we can do is make sure that no design changes are proposed that may compromise the inclusive design strategy. For example, a proposed minor repositioning of a steel column might be put forward to simplify a connection, and it might not have a major structural implication, but it could result in a column projecting from a wall into a corridor. These are the things that as structural engineers we have a responsibility to look for. And of course, as we move towards the end of a project, make sure that we capture and record all of the good practice that we've learned from each project and take it forward to our next one. Work with the rest of the team to learn lessons and share those with others. So now I'm going to talk to you very briefly about a project that I was lucky enough to work on several years ago, where inclusive design was a key consideration from the outset for the whole team. The project is a secondary school in Bristol in the UK, and as you can see from the slide, it was predominantly housed in a 1930s building with a series of other smaller buildings which had been constructed around the site at various times as needs and finances permitted. A new teaching space was required to provide facilities for science labs, art rooms, and general teaching spaces to deal with a growing school population. In addition to this, the opportunity was going to be taken to improve inclusive access across the site and within the existing building. The 1930s building itself was not listed, but the school sits within a conservation area with an active local conservation society. Therefore, it was essential that any changes that were put forward to both the existing building and the surrounding landscape respected this setting. There were a number of issues that needed to be addressed as part of the project. The existing 1930s building had an external stepped access to the front entrance and only stair access to the first floor. The new teaching block was to be constructed to the rear of the existing building, and it was essential that covered access between the new and existing buildings was provided at both ground and first floor level to allow for efficient movement of all students around the site between lessons. At ground level, externally, there was also a significant level change across the site of approximately 2 metres, and a number of protected trees populated the site, which added additional constraints. We as a design team worked together collaboratively from the project outset to develop the various different elements of design as a coherent scheme. We made sure that inclusive design and accessibility were key drivers throughout. And it was really important to ensure that all of the elements were considered together as part of a whole from the start of the project to make sure that experience of end users felt that they were being welcomed into an inclusive space across the site and not just a nice new inclusive building. Two of the key drivers from the project brief that we were keen to make sure that we achieved was a step-free access and circulation across the site between new and existing buildings, and consideration of the impact on existing buildings and landscape within the conservation area. So some of the key considerations for us as structural engineers on the project can be summarised as follows, and you can see on the screen. How do you incorporate a new lift into an existing building? How can you position it in such a way that it doesn't feel like it's just been bolted on the side of an existing building and force a different route and experience for users? How do you balance the unknowns of an existing structure with your proposed interventions? And how can that risk be managed through the design process? The school in this case was to remain operational throughout the works, so careful consideration of how and when we carried out intrusive investigations was really important. This also had a significant impact on the proposed construction and sequencing. We were lucky enough on this project to work with a contractor from an early stage who helped bring these considerations on construction into the design. When you're designing new vertical structure to support a first floor horizontal circulation route, how do you consider inclusive design and make sure that you don't impinge on the circulation route with your vertical structure? And how do we sensibly deal with level changes across the site with ramps and stairs and incorporate these into the landscape so that they feel a cohesive part of the design and not just added on, whilst being sensitive to the conservation area and the protected existing trees? The position of the new building was determined by the overall site layout and other existing buildings. Therefore, one of our first challenges was to determine where and how we could link the new and existing buildings together at both ground and first floor level that would work. We carried out an initial site appraisal of the overall site with the rest of the team and looked at the existing building in order to identify possible locations. This was done not only with the architect but the client as well. It was essential to not only find a location that we could make work structurally, but also to ensure the overall operation of the school and the layout of spaces was the best it could be. As is often the case with existing buildings, there were unknowns about the structure at this early stage, but the options were assessed with the information that we had available and a location selected. The location utilised was an area of the site adjacent to the existing building where the main hall was housed, and was already a transitional space and allowed us to access directly into the existing building into an established corridor. Our new design provided an external covered elevated walkway which provided access from the new first floor classrooms in the new teaching block directly into the first floor of the existing 1930s building. This was designed as a suspended walkway to reduce the number of columns required at ground floor and provide a clearer circulation route. Structurally hanging elements at first floor were positioned within the balustrade zone to avoid structure projecting into the circulation routes, and the roof over the walkway was double the width of the first floor walkway to provide greater weather protection at ground floor and keep columns further apart to give that greater sense of space and free circulation. Adjacent to the new building, the walkway was supported on one side by the new reinforced concrete frame and steel columns on the other. As it projected alongside the existing building as an independent structure, we had two rows of columns, but still maintained the hanging design to keep the columns to a minimum and provided a connection into the existing building at the first floor. This connection was positioned into the heart of the existing building, opposite an existing staircase. The result provided a clear link between the new and existing buildings and allowed movement of people at both ground and first floor levels. The new building was designed to ensure that a new lift was positioned immediately adjacent to the main staircase and the elevated external walkway that I've just described, providing access to the first floor at the same location for all users. However, simply having a lift in the new building was not sufficient as it would have meant that some users would have had a significantly increased travel distance to change levels if they were in the original 1930s building. Therefore, a new lift shaft was constructed within the existing building. An area within the existing building was identified as part of our site appraisal, which was close to the new landing point of the elevated walkway and again directly opposite an existing staircase. At the time, it was being used for cupboard space and storage, and therefore provided a good opportunity and a good location for a new lift, which was in the centre of the existing building. This location helped us to make sure that the lift didn't feel like it had been bolted onto the side as an afterthought, and provided equality of routes throughout the building. Of course, at the time of agreeing the position of the lift, we had limited information about the existing structure and no real information at all about the existing foundations in the area. We progressed the design on the basis of this location, and intrusive investigations in the form of localised opening up and small trial pits were specified and carried out during school Easter holidays in order to try and reduce the risk of unknowns before work commenced on site. These investigations provided additional information which gave us confidence that the location was viable and allowed us to further develop the structural design, taking account of the existing structure and buildability constraints. The result was a new reinforced concrete lift pit, which incorporated some underpinning to existing adjacent walls and a steel lift shaft formed using small standard steel sections, which could be craned into place through a newly formed hole in the roof, which was ready for the lift overrun. The result was a newly constructed lift shaft in a very tight zone, but within the heart of the existing building. One of the other key challenges on the site was a significant level change externally. There was approximately a 2-metre level difference across the site, which historically had been achieved by some fairly dingy concrete steps right at the far corner of site. The aim was to develop a route which was integral to the landscaping and was a route that everybody wanted to use. However, we had an added challenge that there was, in the desired location for this route, we were in close proximity to some trees which had tree protection orders, and we had very limited ability to excavate in their root protection zones. So we needed to come up with a solution that would work. We developed a solution which used precast concrete wall sections to create the level change, with the remaining structural elements being constructed using more lightweight materials with steel and timber and incorporating planting and seating. This was all done in order to keep additional load to a minimum so that the in-situ base for the precast units was shallow as possible and was acceptable to the arboriculturalist and accommodate the step in levels at the edge of the precast units. The use of precast units also had the benefit on programme from perspective, which allowed quick installation in a busy school site. So as you can see, there are things at all stages that we as structural engineers can do, and I hope this has given you some food for thought. I would now like to take the opportunity to hand over to Jenny.
Thank you, Rachel. That was really informative, and I absolutely loved the case study. So I'm going to talk a bit about the journey that Heathrow has been on to become the most accessible airport in the world. No mean feat, as you can imagine. So when you look at most large organisations and clients, we all at heart have some sort of EDI strategy, and this is Heathrow's. Connected to our EDI strategy is Heathrow's sustainability strategy, Heathrow 2.0. In which part we are looking to connect people and planet. And in doing this, we have a number of values that we look to live every day. And in those values, if you align what we are trying to do and what our vision is, then you need to align that with everybody, all humans, and not just the mythical average, as the other speakers have spoken about. So when you're looking at things like improving every day, then we're looking to become open to all and the hub of choice. And in order to do that, we need to design in a way that is fit for everybody. We also want to become the most inclusive employer. And again, that requires us to think more holistically about what each human needs in order to be able to work and thrive at Heathrow. When we're looking at things like keeping everyone safe, that has to be everyone. And at the moment, we understand that safety is not as equitable as we would like it to be. And we need to keep that in mind when we're designing to ensure that we haven't created barriers for individuals to be able to work, live and thrive at Heathrow. And joining to this, working together in collaboration, as everybody's been talking to, understanding the neurodivergent differences and making sure that everybody, no matter their sensory, their physical or other cultural requirements, are met as we build and design our hub, to make sure that each of those values are lived within our structures. So moving on in terms of how we would look to do this, over 3 years ago, I started with the concept that actually, when we're looking at inclusively designing, there are more than just the output of the users. There is actually more steps than that in what we need to do. And in England or in the UK here, we have something called the Construction Design Management 2015 regulations, which requires us to look at how we are going to inclusively build or safely build our structures and our infrastructure. And if we want to make sure that we have thought about each individual, each human that is involved in that build, we need to think much more widely about the demographics that we're designing for. We need to think more widely and inclusively about the operators and the maintainers of those buildings. When we design these structures with great glass roofs, are we thinking about how they're going to be maintained, whether it's able to be maintained and who is going to be able to maintain them? Are we creating barriers to that demographics that we would like to work to operate and maintain our buildings and our structures by not thinking about the demographics that will be asked to operate and maintain them? And then leading on to obviously the access and use. And as everybody's been saying, design has an intent and a purpose. And quite often in recent times, we have allowed the exclusion to become a habit, and we call it a standard. And until we really interrogate that standard and ask who is it delivering for and who's been excluded, we then realize that inclusion is actually a choice that each of us can make. We recognize that exclusion, we look at the human diversity and how humans adapt within spaces. And from that, we can then shape the world that we are living in instead of it shaping us. So quite often we have an ability bias. So we solve problems based on our own experience and our own abilities. And what we need to be able to do is actually, as others have said on the call, include more other voices, include more diversity into our world as we design, by designing with and not for. So in my chapter, what I talk about is procurement, and why procurement is so important to how we can ensure that we are actually designing for all. So Heathrow, as I said, published the Heathrow 2.0, which covers a number of different areas for our sustainability strategy. And why should this be important? Well, the UN Principles for Responsible Investment that a number of signatories signed up to requires us to have these ESGs that we are working towards to demonstrate that we are responsible investment for our shareholders. And in order to do that, we need to show how we're going to meet that. And when you link that to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, you understand that actually we need to make sure we're not leaving anybody behind. When we're connecting people and planet, we need to make sure we are connecting that equitably, and we are not allowing for others to be privileged and some to be disadvantaged because of the way that we've designed our spaces. So in February 22, when we relaunched Heathrow 2.0 and refreshed our sustainability strategy, we realized that the bar by definition is what we will accept and what we will expect. So we set the bar high. And from this, we created our vision to meet that net zero in the air and on the ground, but also to make Heathrow a great place to live and work. And what we recognised from events such as Grenfell, where so many needlessly died within that incident, we realised that actually within the design of our structures becomes an important element of ensuring that that equitable safety is at the heart of what we do. The materials that we use need to ensure that we are as others have said, making sure that the spaces will allow for the light, for the access and egress, for the transfer at level, for all of the things that have been considered. National Rail, unfortunately, in the UK, built an amazing bridge across their one of their railway lines. Unfortunately, within that bridge, the structural design included steps. So by definition, therefore excluding some from being able to use it. So what we've said is that in order to create a thriving supply chain, we've distilled the 2.0 objectives and set clear targets on each of the elements. And for our strategic supply chain partners, we are measuring that progress for the environmental, the social and the economic impacts that they are having locally for our airport, but also across the world. And in this, we've created the Balanced Scorecard, which is a tool by which we ensure that we have the best resources and expertise within our infrastructure and with our buildings. And we celebrate that success with different levels of gold, silver and bronze. So examples of this will be through looking at the surface access elements of how you access our airport, whether you are a worker, a colleague or a traveller. And if you think about the different elements as discussed in terms of things like whereabouts we will have lifts, or how we will access in terms of the transfer from buses or rail into the airport, it becomes an integral part of making sure we're not creating barriers for different individuals. We look at also the opportunities and the innovation in our case studies in looking at how we can minimise waste and reuse our resources by designing right first time. And all of these elements will lead into making sure that we are reaching these sustainable development goals, which will make us a much more likely investment in the future. So if I finish up and wrap up from all the wonderful talks that you have been through today, what I would ask you to do, as others have, is to understand first who you are. Where do you come from? What are the things that you've experienced in your life that have been barriers? How did it feel when those barriers affected you? And what would you do differently, or what would you ask of differently so those barriers could be removed? By understanding you and being you, you give the same permission to others, and you ensure that they are able to raise their voice. One of the examples that I give of unequitable safety is an instance when I was looking one site as a project manager doing a health and safety walk, walking across the rebar that was there for the floor slab. And every step I took, I knew I was unsafe. I knew I was unsafe because I'm a 5-foot woman with a size 5 foot, and that rebar was very difficult for me to walk across. But I wanted to seem like a competent project manager that was able to do her job and no different from anybody else on site. And so I didn't say anything, and I walked across that rebar, and in my gut, I knew that I could hurt myself in that instance. And reflecting on it, a couple of months afterwards, I realized that if I didn't feel safe enough to put my hand up and say this wasn't designed for me, then nobody else on that site would do the same thing. And if I didn't give them permission to tell me that it wasn't designed for them, how was I going to influence the future generations, the future of that structure, to ensure that they were as safe as each other, that equitable safety existed? So widen your lens and get curious. Who's not in the room? Who do you think you may have excluded in the design? Where are the elements? Where is it good? Where are the things out there that really make you feel alive and belong? And get curious about why. What is it with those things? And which areas really do make you feel like you shudder and you curl up and you do not want to be there? You feel unsafe. Why are they? And understand how we can better influence our standards, better influence to make sure that the future generations are definitely in a place that they belong. Clean your thinking. Quite often we use the standards and we use them as our foundation because we do not want to have to think too hard in an environment where quite often there are many pressures on us to be able to provide the input, etc., in quick time. But in doing that, allow that time, allow that space to clean your thinking. Who haven't you thought of? What could go wrong? What are the elements, as others have said, that might impact that design to make it a barrier for others? And in doing that, deliver better. measure yourself against the different elements in terms of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, etc. Learn from each other, learn as design teams. As they said earlier on, within the plan of works, there are so many different designers involved and so many different opportunities to learn and develop and improve.